Hello and welcome to the first conversation I'm hosting here on Actual Spirit. Today I'm here with famous Hegelian and Tantric philosopher Alexander Bard, and we're talking about Western Tantra, sex, drugs, and psychoanalysis. So Alexander, let's first go into the history of Tantra and see how it has emerged. So what has been the historical function of Tantra and how has it emerged in the Eastern religion?
Okay, so in the Eastern religions, and I would also add Zoroastrianism and Judaism to that, there's always a divide between, the Sutra and the Tantra. Fundamentally, the Sutric realm is what keeps a society together. So this is the glue of a society. The way I describe Sutra is that you teach Sutra so that people will be able to love their children, so that families will be held together. Families, clans, tribes can work. This is fundamental for Sutra. So there has to be a religion for the people to start with, and that has to work before you do anything tantric. So the problem then is that there are a lot of things going on in the world that aren't necessarily much good for society as a whole. And those forces also need to be contained. And the way you did in the East was that you basically called that Tantra. So you labeled it and said, this is not for everybody. This is actually only for the people who are well-versed at it. This is for the people who are prepared for it or educated towards doing it, and preferably also do it in isolation. So this is why we say today, when we're going to develop a Western Tantra, that it's not just about tantric sex. It's also about, for example, taking drugs, like doing psychedelics, which is incredibly intense, not for everybody. You must be well prepared. And this is also the difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Psychotherapy is when you go and see a psychologist who is there to fix you, to send you back into society, right? Psychoanalysis is just the incessant pursuit of truth. You must be healthy first before you pursue psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is a perfect example of something which is tantric, the same way sex and drugs can be tantric. The problem was, though, that in the West, we basically banned everything tantric and called it sin. And this is something Christianity and Islam, boringly enough, have in common. This is why I find these religions not only to be inferior, but also find these religions to be utterly boring. It's something very boring about Christianity and Islam. And it has to do with the fact that the very tantric forces these are incredibly sutric religions. So the attempt Christianity and Islam did was basically to outright ban tantric exercises and then just call them sin. And the irony is that there's a shift here, there's a twist to it, which you would find very interesting as a young philosopher, because it hasn't been fully developed. But the irony is that Islam and Christianity have both nurtured what's called the cult of transparency. They nurtured a cult that everything that ever happens, everything that happens in heaven and hell, should be made publicly accessible. You can see here that modern journalism starts with Christianity. It's the idea that, when Christ was on the cross, the curtain in the temple fell, and there was no longer any difference between the sacred room and the most sacred room in the Jewish temple. Meaning that the difference between Christianity and Judaism is that Judaism believes that there must be what's called a barred absolute, B-A-R-R-E-D. Like if your subjectivity is barred to you, it's never accessible to you. Also, there must be barred absolute, in the sense there must be an obstacle. There must be something you can never get beyond. Your own death is a perfect example of barred absolute. But there is also barred absolute in religion, meaning that in front of the barred absolute, we are sutric, and we speak in public. And everything we do involves the entire congregation or all of the people, for example, in the democratic process. But behind the barred absolute, the most sacred room, only the priest can go, or only those who are initiated can go. And that's where you do the tantric practices. So the irony is that Islam and Christianity are both cults of transparency, that everything should be public, but at the same time, they've also banned what was supposed to happen behind the barred absolute, whereas Eastern religion has always maintained that there is a barred absolute. You're a child, you become an adult, then you must become an adult among the adults, or a sage, to be able to go behind the barred absolute, and there you can pursue the tantric practices. You can tell that I'm in big favor here of the Eastern religions, but I would also say that Zoroastrianism coming out of Persia and Judaism coming out of Palestine are two religions that also practice this differentiation between the sutric and the tantric, but not Christianity and not Islam.
Right, yeah, what immediately comes up for me, what I've written about in the upcoming Hegel anthology, is Freud's civilization and its discontents. So Freud talks about the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And the pleasure principle is, the fact that our body wants to enjoy it, wants to have its drives and desires satisfied. And in our lives, we come up against the reality principle, which is basically the father coming up to us and saying, no, you cannot enjoy, you cannot eat whatever you want, you have to clean up after yourself, and this kind of stuff. So in the paper, I call this proto-sutra, and I say that sutra is a kind of perhaps more conscious way of instantiating the reality principle. So as you said, like Christianity and Islam, we have like, celibacy, for example. Christian nuns.
Freud was Jewish. And he hated Christianity.
Yeah.
He hated Christianity with a vengeance, as any decent Jew should do, and deservedly does. So what he did was that he said, basically, if you then go on to follow up with Lacan, you will discover that what Freud's initially saying there is that if you create that obstacle, the father, or the authoritative figure says you must not do this. This creates an even larger enjoyment in you to actually pursue it anyway. And this was one of Freud's great insights, that civilization is built on this. And in our work, John Soderqvist and I wrote a book called Digital Libido, which is built on civilization's discontent. It's essentially digital civilization and its mass discontent. It's just like, it's going to get even worse, and under digital and digital libido, you can hear it's a very Freudian book. We basically argue that this process now being repeated all over again. And again, we then return to the fact that the barred absolute must be installed again in culture, otherwise we're lost.
Right. I think that's such a misconception here in the West that has to be overcome, this idea that every religion is pure sutra. Every time we hear about religion, it's boring, it's sutra, it's no
the phenomenon.
No
the phenomenon has a name. It's called finding the preacher in the whorehouse.
The preacher in the whorehouse, yeah.
Finding the preacher in the whorehouse. It's very good. It's perfect. We know this happens constantly. We know that these pillar saints who preach about a world without sin, and there was a world without sin, and then we had the fall, and then we became sinners, and he loves this so much. He loves the sinning so much. He obviously goes to whorehouse and fucks a whore, after he's done his preaching, and he lives in between these two worlds. He does the preaching, and then he goes off and has immense amounts of sex in the whorehouse. And in reality, of course, he should. It's the people who are shocked that he did this we should really watch out for, because the people who are really dangerous aren't even the preacher. These are the people who pretend to be shocked when they find out the preacher has gone to the whorehouse. But preachers have gone to whorehouse forever. Christian ministers, like Catholic ministers, have been pedophiles for the last 2,000 years. So that comes without saying. We got a religion where you worship a child as a perfect god. It's not surprising that you get pedophiles in such a religion. But this is the case. Whenever we try to create an obstacle against our own drives and our own desires, our drives and desires only return with even more of a vengeance. This is important to understand. This is Freud's great insight.
Yeah, totally. And that's where Tantra comes in, because Tantra isn't just the pleasure principle run amok. It's not like do whatever you want and don't have the boundaries of the reality principle. The tantric realm, as I call it, is a container for the exploration of the pleasure principle that you go into and then come out to go back into your sutric life. So it's not like Tantra is opposed to
again, it's dialectics, right? So you end up in between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And in a way, to go even deeper, these are the two gazes we are looking for in our life. So this is the matrical gaze first. So think of it like you're being born, which is the worst thing that will ever happen to you. The original trauma is birth itself, right? That's what we can't remember. It's Lacan pointed out. None of us can remember it. New Age people who do rebirthing have no idea what they're talking about. You don't want to be reborn. You don't want to be born again. It's just like, no, it's done. You can't remember it, thank God. And it's precisely because it initiates a denial that you want to die, and you deny that, which is what libido is. Libido is the denial of the axial motive at the bottom of things. So at the bottom of things is the death drive. You deny that you want to die, and that denial is so strong that it works, and that's what libido is. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to live. So after you've done that, imagine the first thing that greets you. It's an older woman, the midwife, usually grandmother or something similar, not the woman who gave birth to you, because you're just leaving her. You're getting out of the matrix. What meets you is the matrical gaze, as we call it. of the other woman. And this gaze is one of, oh, little darling, you're being born. It's just endless, infinite, unconditional love. And we put this in our philosophy at the beginning of life and at the end of life. In a way, if you go really, really deep into the death wish, you will discover that you somehow imagine that there's a woman there with a warm embrace who lets go of you when you die, which is the return to the womb in our own mythos. It's a return to the matrix, because you dissolve yourself and your self is gone and you're back to where you were before you were born, when you did not exist. The world operated fantastically without you. The world would operate fantastically without you when you die. And the thing that survives in between these two and transcends these two things is the tribe, the original tribe, or the sociant. That's what we imagine. So there's a people in a world, and you're part of that people, and you're one of its representatives while you're alive. And this is life. But during life, you're looking for the phallic gaze. And this is the fundamental difference. So the pleasure principle plays into the magical gaze, because as soon as the grandmother or the midwife has greeted you in life, she takes you over to the breast of the woman who just gave birth to your mother, and you are breastfed. And it's breastfeeding. We emphasize this in our work. There wasn't anybody in psychoanalysis who properly developed the idea of the mamilla. But the mamilla, the breast, today we would call it the welfare state. Like the breast, you suck the breast and you're united again with the world, and yourself doesn't have to exist. So birth, essentially, the mother realizing the mother and child are different. You don't realize that the child and the mother are different until the Oedipus or Electra complex happens at about 1 year of age. Then you realize the mother and you are not the same thing. You have to push away that tick, and you have to start hating for the first time in your life. This is female psychoanalysis. Julia Kristeva in the 1980s wrote a beautiful little book on how the child has to push away the mother. The mother cannot let go of the child no matter what happens. The magical gaze can never let go of you, but you push away the magical because you want the phallic. And of course, this is like, mother is attracted to something that isn't me or that I cannot have. That isn't me, Oedipus complex, that I cannot have, Electra complex. And in gay people, this is reversed. So that makes perfect sense, right? So you push away the tit, you start hating for the first time in life, you objectify the tit. The tit becomes your first habit. So mamilla has to be hated. So you get away from the mamilla, and then you look around to go towards the phallus. And your entire childhood, up until your teenage years, when you rebel against the phallus to become phallic yourself, all those years are your childhood. And the phallus is what you love to go towards, whereas mamilla is what you need to get away from. But because you are dependent on the grown-up world and your parents for your survival, you still have to have mamilla. This is that your parents take care of you. It's society that the sociant takes care of you. That's the mamilla, until you break from the mamilla completely in your teenage years, go towards the phallus, transcends the phallus, rebels against it, realize your parents weren't gods, but just parents, and then realize that you yourself is human and not God either. And that's the completion of the teenage rebellion. That's the completion of the rebellion against the phallus. And then you can become a grown-up person and become sutric. And then the journey starts from sutra to tantra. So we know what the journey from sutra to tantra is. It is the journey from child to adult, just repeated. So you become an adult among the adults. That's what being tantric means.
Okay, that's a lot there, and it's very interesting. So would you say that this there seems to be among those priests that you've talked about with pedophilia, this desire to go beyond the sutric, that sutric life just simply isn't enough for some people?
Oh yeah, I mean, part of the pedophilia and its attraction is, of course, that it's banned. And it's perfect to be gay if you're in the Catholic Church as well. And I'm not saying being gay and pedophile is the same thing, certainly not. But anything that's banned creates a surplus enjoyment. And that's why Christian culture is full of all the surplus enjoyment. So is Muslim culture. And that is deeply problematic, because then we don't regulate. What Eastern philosophy realizes, you need to regulate, you need to license, you need to contain the tantric forces. And that's exactly what you and I were working with Tantra. And you're like a young genius at Tantra, and you're doing tantric philosophy now as well. So when you do that, you know that you need a certain calling, you need a certain personality type, an archetype, a personal archetype, to be able to handle these forces and then pursue them. And you realize that if the sutra doesn't work in a society, there's no way you can go into the tantric realm, because then you got nothing but anarchic chaos ahead of you. Exactly.
Yeah, so that's so crucial, that if you go into the tantric realm, you do need to have some kind of spiritual, very honest inclination to yourself. Because if you don't have this and you go into the tantric realm and you encounter yourself in a negative manner, that you'll not be able to handle it, and that will be actually destructive to you.
Yeah, I can give you a perfect example of this, where this goes wrong. It's modern day politics. We are encouraging politicians to, cross the line of the acceptable. There's nobody's a happier sinner today than a politician. But if he does something and then it's revealed in public, it's called a scandal, then the politician has to resign. Now, please note that every time a corrupt politician resigns, he or she is being replaced with something worse. They're being replaced with a politician who seriously never crosses the line. And that's the worst leader you can have. So I definitely prefer the preacher in the whorehouse when he's found in the whorehouse and it's being scandalized. I think that's a human being who's alive. And that's definitely better preaching than replacing the preacher with somebody who's unscandalous and will never commit the scandal, because these are the worst people. And we're exploring this in our new book, Process and Event. John Soderqvist are exploring this. This is the problem. The problem isn't that we got wealthy and we got well fed and the populations grew. And then we got a lot of these guys running around making all kinds of fancy ideas during the axial age, which is problematic. The problem was that we then scandalized the very people who were tantric. We scandalized the crazy wisdom teachers that we desperately need. And instead, we just got leaders who mimic leadership, and who in turn were mimicked by the rest of us as role models. And this is the most unfruitful society you can have. It's stale, it's dead. And we have arrived at a point in history when all my politician friends tell me that, no, I can't do that any longer because now the internet is around, so it becomes scandal. I'm just like, well, if you're never breaking the law, you don't know what the law is. And this is something, of course, Lacan discusses, Slavoj Žižek discusses this, Barton Soderqvist discussed this, because now we're doing sort of psychoanalysis as philosophy. We call it socioanalysis. That's what we need to do in the 21st century. Now we do this, we discover that these mechanisms are really screwed up. They're really corrupt. We do not want the uncorrupted politician, because the uncorrupted politician is worse than the corrupted version. And this is fundamentally Freudian, to understand that.
So I agree with you there. And I would like to bring it back to sex, drugs, and psychoanalysis. So you told me this narrative about being born, and we have the pleasure principle and the reality principle, the matrix of the phallus and the mamilla. And what is the place of sex here then? Because it seems like in sex we want to go back to the matrix. Is that how we should view it? And also,
well,
like how does tantra, how is tantric sex qualitatively different?
If you're a man with a penis, you're heterosexual. You try to revisit the place you came from. So you go back and you go back into the cave, so to speak, and you're there as a visitor. And then you realize that nature is fooling you, because all nature wants to do is to release your sperm, hit an egg, and somebody else gets to do what you were longing for, which is to be born. So it's called a child. So something transcends you. That's how nature literally milks you for your resources, to then having to, of course, support the woman who gives birth to your child, right? So it's a trick of nature, but it is, that's what you do. So there's a lot of that going on in sexuality. But let's go back to the Enlightenment in Europe and see what actually happens. If you look at Nietzsche and the concept of the death of God, the way we need to look at it from a, say, more Jewish or Zoroastrian perspective, what Nietzsche did was that he completed a revolution in the West, which is that the doors to the tantric arm that were opened by Christianity, the whole tantric arm was completely exposed to Western culture. And this became the culture we have today. And we're now getting to the point where we're discovering that 5-year-olds are watching hardcore pornography, and 6-year-olds are taking drugs, and all kinds of weird things are going on, because we have no stopping mechanism for this to happen, because we haven't installed the difference between Tantra and Sutra in our culture. So in Japan, China, India, and other places, there's still at least part of it in culture is still the difference between the sutra and the tantra. It's a bit like, you're not ready for this yet. If you're a child, if you're a grown-up, means you will never be ready for this. Other people are, but not you. That's sort of the condition for the tantra, right? So the problem is that the Enlightenment in the 17th century believed in the Christian call to transparency without believing in Christianity. So it finished off with Christianity it started, which is to let everybody gaze all the way into the temple and discover God wasn't there. That's the death of God, and no culture can handle it. Nietzsche is absolutely right. There is no culture that can handle the death of God. And that's where we're stuck now, because we were so greedy in Western culture that we wanted to have both the Tantra and the Sutra as if they were the same thing. We wanted to get rid of the Christian concept of sin, which we did. And we arrived in a sort of nihilistic state of hedonism, which is the Freudian point if we look at society today. So the question is then, what can we learn from history? Well, we can learn that no society can hold itself together long-term without separating the Tantra and the Sutra. And therefore, that has to be installed in our culture. And the one thing we have to learn from the East is the difference between Tantra and Sutra. This is the real lesson after Nietzsche. And Hegel is the answer to that, because Hegel does dialectics. It has to be a dialectical process where the opposition of Sutra and Tantra is installed into culture. And then we can look at current culture and say, we don't want this. So the negation in Hegelian sense is to say no to the current state of things. This did not work. Our kids are being fucked up. This will not be sustainable.
Right.
And then after we've done that, we could possibly start looking at a dialectical process. We reinstall the difference between Tantra and Sutra in our culture. And then we start from the secularization. We kill Christianity, get it out the door, and redevelop religion that actually makes sense to us. I call this religion reformed paganism, because all religion is paganism. Think of it as reformed paganism. In my case, I'm a Zoroastrian. I converted. You could be a Jew. You could be a Buddhist. You could be Taoist. But you have to start from religion that believes in the difference between Tantra and Sutra, and believes that this difference, this fundamental dialectical difference, keeps a society together.
Yeah, what's really beautiful about this explanation that there's a necessity of having a sutric and tantric division in society is that with the Enlightenment and the death of God, you have these ideologies, like basically religions as political convictions emerging, like communism and fascism. Like, for example, communism, like, you know, the paper of the communist parties was always called The Truth. So there's no, like, there's no division between Tantra and Sutra in like some kind of scientific narrative. So science is impotent. We have to go beyond science and really go to religion to rethink how we structure our societies in regards to these deep pathic drives that we have as humans.
Yeah, and of course, both fascism and communism developed the party as a concept. So you were either inside the party and you were a minority, and they pretended to be the tantric force, and then everybody else was outside the party, not allowed in. You have to have a difference between people.
Yeah,
you must
it reemerges anyway.
And they did it in an authoritarian manner. And of course, now these days, if you look into the Chinese Communist Party, you're part of the power structure if you're a member of the party, but the whole thing of the Tantra Sutra divide in Chinese culture is a parody. And this is where you arrive. You arrive at parody, a parody of what used to be. So to understand that Western culture is not built on Christianity, Western culture, like Muslim culture, the other Western culture, are both built on the cult of transparency. And the irony here is that the internet today completes the cult of transparency. We're obsessed with finding everything we possibly can online. And now we're discovering walls are being built online. You cannot go past these walls. Gated communities are being built in our societies. You cannot go past this gate. We're seeing the barred absolute being reinstalled everywhere in culture. And the internet, as it develops, will first kill the cult of transparency by completing it dialectically. And once the cult of transparency is completed, the internet will be full of walls that says you cannot get in here. And we call this the Tower of God. You know, there's a dream about the Garden of God, which is the completion of agriculture. There's a dream about the City of God, which is the completion of industrialization. The third major dream that actually drives culture is the Tower of God. And the Tower of God is essentially tower, a phallic tower towards the sky. That's a door. And on the door, there's a sign that says, you won't get in there. Your children may, but not you. And that keeps progress going throughout society, throughout history. What keeps history going in a Hegelian sense is precisely the sign that says you cannot get in here. Only those who transcend you can get inside this door. You never will. And of course, that tower then is the future. It's the future beyond your own death. So this is fundamental. It's very Jewish, very Zoroastrian, but we have to take that into our culture. I think Islam and Christianity are over. They're mass religions, they're pop religions, but flies love shit. And I think the fact that we've gone through these very extreme fundamentalist stages in the 20th century really exposes that they're over. The Christians are no longer Christian, the Muslims are no longer Muslim. That's exactly why they become fundamentalists. And it's the end of those religions, the pop religions of the cult of transparency, because we have to go now into a world we accept that the Tantric and the Sutric will be prevalent everywhere.
So to bring it back to the title, what is sex? Like, and why do we care about sex in Tantra, and how is and drugs?
Why don't you answer the question? You do the sex and I do the drugs. So you start, because you're brilliant to me, Jay. What is sex?
Well, Alenka Zupancic, she's a Hegelo-Lacanian philosopher, and she wrote a book called What is Sex?
Which also had the undertitle, The Least Sexy Book You Will Ever Read.
Right. Right, it was.
Which of course creates the obstacle that you want to read the book. Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, it is a great book, and she conceptualizes sex as the non-relation. So for her, like, the masculine and feminine meet phantasmatically, but really don't actually meet. And it's that asymmetrical, vibrations that attract us to each other.
Yeah, it's the asymmetry. It's the fact that the woman is alien to you that makes you attracted to her. And it's the fact that the man is alien to the woman that makes the man attractive to her. And of course, this works the other way in gay relationships, because in gay relationships, among gay men, you want to fuck the straight guy, but you never get to fuck him. You only get to fuck your gay friend. And if a straight guy manages to fuck in the ass, then he becomes gay anyway. So the obstacle in gay culture is that you can never fuck the straight guy.
Yeah.
And the obstacle in lesbian culture is that the masculine split between the logos and pathos is being repeated in the relationship. So lesbians tend to be serially monogamous. They're monogamous all the time, but they never found what they're looking for. So what they're looking for is the logos pathos split in men, but they look for it in another woman. And what usually happens is that one of them takes on the pathical character of being a man as a woman, which is the butch type, and one of them takes on the logical character of being a man, which is actually the femme. And you will discover that lesbian femmes are very reasonable. They're often good leaders among women and things like that. So you will discover that the logos pathos divide, which is fundamentally the man, the split, is what lesbian women are attracted to, but want to find it in women. And with gay men, it's the opposite. It's the unity that you're trying to look for, which is female. You try to look for that. So it makes sense, because the gays and lesbians reflect symmetrically the heterosexual relationship between men and women. But it's always an impossibility. What drives sex or sexuality, it drives sex, is the impossibility. You are fucking something you don't know. You're fucking something you're forever attracted to. You can't figure out why you're attracted to it. You can't stop being attracted to it. You hate that you're attracted to it. Yeah. You're completely dependent on this fucking attraction. You're obsessed with it. You think of nothing else, that's sex.
Yeah. So and that's where the difference comes in between, like, being thrown into life and, developing your sexuality on your own, and having tantric containers where you have tantric teachers who actually help you in this process and teach you, what are things happening in sexuality. For example, take de-armoring. The body tends to be very armored and tensed up, and this leads to pain on the side of women in sex. And these are actually issues that you can resolve, but people just don't have any knowledge about them. And because we have this baseline sutra, sex is a taboo. So there is no actual sexual education. So I'd say, like, the new Tantra is an institution of sexual education, really.
Absolutely. And when Alexa Vartman started the new Tantra, it was because Western sex lives were so fucking miserable.
Yeah.
And of course, David Data opened the door in America for the modern, serious schools of Tantra. I call it Tantric sexology. So what I mean with Tantric sexology is that it is really sex education for grown-ups, and it has to be done. And you remove everything else and just go straight to the sex and the sexual act and the sexual technique itself, and then you teach it. And it's the weirdest thing ever. There is nothing that modern people are more obsessed with than sex. And somehow they think it's the only thing they don't have to learn. It's just the weirdest idea.
Yeah.
Like when you're 50 years old, you automatically know how to make love to a woman, or a woman would know how to make love to a man. And people are terrible at it. Yeah. They're terrible at sex, you know? So just like they're terrible at doing drugs properly, knowing what they're doing, you know, they throw anything into their mouth and then of course they go and die and all kinds of weird shit happens and they become abusive, you know, because they don't know what they're doing. They don't have the knowledge. And that's why I practice what I call tantric pharmacology. So we have to teach what drugs are to modern people, and we have to teach them to be careful, and we have to teach them everything is probably possible when you go into the realm of the tantric pharmacology, but it's a long journey. And it's not about being happy, or it's not about, you know, compensating for problems you haven't solved in your life, or becoming, you know, an abuse or anything. It's actually a really hard, tough journey because it's a tantric journey. Right. And that's what we talk about: tantric sexology, tantric pharmacology. And if you then look at psychoanalysis, we would call it tantric philosophy.
Right. I think that the triad that emerges here is that one can have an abstract intention before having a tantric experience, a psychedelic trip, or a new tantra workshop. Well, that fantasy is then negated in the tantric realm. And out of that emerges the integration, like the question, how are you going to take those lessons from the tantric realm, those experiences, back to your daily life? And I think it's the same with sex and psychedelics, essentially. It
is. And that's exactly also why I always advise people very strongly not to mix sex and psychedelics. Get yourself a good sex life and stay sober, because sex is its own drug. And one of the great things so far with psychedelics is this, it's like the secret of all Tantra teachers, is that women and men react so differently to psychedelics that there are some psychedelics that make women horny, but not men. And there are some psychedelics that make men horny, but not women. And thankfully, we don't have the sex drugs that make them both horny at the same time. Thank God, because you have no idea, being a psychoanalyst, how often I've sat down with these couples who really love each other and they destroyed their sex life by doing drugs while they did sex. Literally destroyed them. And all I can say is that you fucked it up. You fucked it up.
Will you say the relationship
you can't have sober sex any longer. And if you can't have sober sex with each other, I can only, you know, I can only sit here and weep with you, but I can't do anything about it, because you've literally fucked it up. You associate each other's bodies and genital organs and everything with the drug.
Yeah.
And without the drug, you can't do it any longer. And you were too greedy, and which is the first lesson learned in Tantra. If you're too greedy and ask for too much, you're going to get nothing out at the end of the day.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Be careful. And here's a Vartman I strongly agree. We used to send people back and forth between our different camps in Bali. That's how we got to know each other. So my deep love and respect for Alexa Vartman goes back years. And I think what I tried to perfect was the tantric pharmacology. Now I can also teach tantric sexology, and Vartman can certainly do the other way around as well. But the point is that if you create a realm for tantric sex, specialize in tantric sex, do nothing but tantric sex. And if you ever do a drug, you can smoke a little weed or something, you know, basically because you didn't come that night. So here's to celebrate you, good boy. You didn't come. Have a little spliff, you know, but no more than that. No more than that ever, because when you do tantric cells, as you probably have explored by now, Dimitri, you cute little boy, you will discover it's so fucking fantastic that you don't want anything in there. It's a bit like trying to mix Japanese and Indian cooking. No, you never put chili in Japanese cooking because it's so subtle. Japanese cooking is so subtle. It's a bit like tantric sex. Indian cooking is more like tantric pharmacology. Throw in anything you got, make it even spicier, and then try to eat it and see what it tastes like, right? But the difference between Indian and Japanese cuisine, both fantastic, is a bit like the difference between tantric pharmacology and tantric sexology, because sex is all about fine nuances.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And for sure, like after going to the TNT workshops level 1 and 2, I can say that I would have never thought that I could have feel those things that I felt in that realm. Like when you have 50 people in one room, and with all the things that go on there, which I can't talk about because of the Bard Absolute, like it's totally unknown for people with just a very normal sex life, which they've learned from you know, porn and things like this.
I think we're actually creating the best fucking advertising ever for the new Tantra right here and now.
Aren't we? Yeah.
It's a bit like a father and a son discussing how fantastic tantric sex is, but it is, it is.
I want to since we're on this topic. So in Hegelian Tantra, this thing I'm speculating on right now, I have this concept called the edging of the absolute. And this is basically the perverse underbelly of absolute knowing. This is what Zizek would say about it. So you have the concept of the infinite now, and these concepts are actually pretty much the same. So could you tell me, what is your idea about the infinite now?
Okay.
In the tantric realm.
Okay, so I think it's really important to do what I call an ecstasology. It's lacking in philosophy because philosophy has been too Christian until now. An ecstasology is a philosophy that deals specifically with ecstatic states. The infinite now always has to have a barred absolute within itself. There has to be some kind of an exception that's not involved. So for example, when you and I say tantric sex is fine without the drugs, remove something, have a negation, and therefore you can enjoy it. The same thing goes with the infinite now. You can tell from the name, it's a self-contradiction. So the proper Hegelian way to look at ecstasy and the experience of ecstasy is this. The infinite now is a state that is so ecstatic that if you had to state it, it would be absolute hell. But because it's temporary, which everything is in Hegelianism, because it is temporary, it can be enjoyed directly and intensely. This is what the Greeks called agape, or divine love, experience of divine love. It's often associated with some kind of oneness with the world because it is a return to the womb, but it's temporary. The way you return to the womb when you as a man with a penis fucks a pussy, the same thing happens here. So the infinite now is that you can either go through the sexual realm to the agape, which is going from eros to agape to speak Greek, or you can go from the philia, which is usually you take a drug with a best friend or something like that, and you use a drug rather than the sexual, and therefore you can go towards that state, the agape state. But when you arrive at the agape state, its intense nature is one of, I don't want to stay here. I just want to visit. And precisely if you want to visit, you can save your libido. Otherwise, your libido will be lost and you'll be nothing but potential when you got out of the experience, which is exactly why people who go for kick seeking must be banned from the tantric realm, because they will finally only go for the kick. And the only kick left when you go for kick seeking is death itself. You'll kill yourself. That's what you'll always end up if you go for the kick seeking. So ban the kick seeking, the first thing you do, because you do want to keep people alive, and therefore the libido is kept alive by trying to search for and find the infinite now. And of course, the infinite now, because you survive it and because you live it, and you live it to experience it, is the ultimate ecstatic state. We set this concept of the infinite now in our book, Synthesis. I think it's profound. It needs to be installed in our culture so that we can get rid of the kick seeking and we can look at what we're really looking for. And here's where the sutric comes back into the tantric. You create an exception. So for example, I'm a man. I really want to figure out how the female mind works. I pursue the female truth. One day I discover exactly how women operate. My heterosexuality is dead because the whole secret has been exposed to me. What do I do before I get there then? Well, I become a pervert. I experience sexuality through other men who fuck women. I go into threesomes and I can truly enjoy them. And for some people to go all that way to the tantric, like I want the mystery to be revealed to me. I want the mystery to be killed to me. That looks eerily like kick seeking towards death, doesn't it? But if you then put yourself in a group of people, you make yourself a tribal creature rather than an individual. But if you make tribal and you start having several relationships with different people, you can certainly go there. And for some people, that is just a pursuit they must take. So this is a perfect example of how you look at the tantric. The tantric removes you and yourself towards the tribal ritual. And then when you look at the tribal ritual developed over millions of years and you get rid of all the sin and all that bullshit, or the nuclear family and it's just him and her forever and all that nonsense, the Vartan I hate. And you look at sexuality for what it is, which is the symbolization of sex, and you look at sex for what it is. So sex is something we share with animals, sexuality is something distinctly human. This is what we call desire and drive. And we look at desire and drive fully. then you realize you can make the journey all the way to the very end of it. But if you want to go to the very end of it, make an exception. For example, if you want to live a relationship as a heterosexual man and never ever argue and never ever have a drama, you need to live with another guy. But if you fuck women together, you can make the woman the exception. So you say, we put the sexual act itself outside our relationship. That's what monks do. That's what nuns do. They live with their own gender.
Not the Christian ones.
Outside of Christianity, they fuck like mad, as you know, any Buddhist monk would do. Like, you know, so even Orthodox monks do. So they have great sex, and monks and nuns are often the best tantric sexual teachers you could have. But what they do basically is they say, but I live with other men. Therefore, the exception to my enjoyment is woman herself. If you live with a woman, you have to put the exception somewhere else. And thank God, by making woman such a mystery, you don't get her. And if you stay in the realm where you don't get her, you will still be sexually attracted to her. You will have to live with the constant drama. You'll have to live with the constant miscommunications and misperceptions between men and women. But on the other hand, that is also putting, you know, a log on the fire of the sexual attraction. So basically what people do is that they argue and have the drama, and then they fuck each other to bits.
Yeah. It's also, I would say it's also the, I'm not a woman, obviously, but it's also the other way around, you know, living with a man, like it kind of demystifies him. And it can, like in a monogamous relationship, the sexual attraction is sometimes can go down, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think about monogamy and Tantra? Do you think Tantra is explicitly non-monogamous in that sense?
Well, I was tired of monogamy as a concept because I realized that men have basically set it up, and men have set it up as keeping women as property, which is a very Western tradition, by the way. It's actually, it comes from warrior culture rather than agrarian culture, but let's not go there today in this conversation. We can pick that up later. But when I've lived with women in female communities as one or only one of two men or something, like a small minority men, basically are there to be observant, like you often do in tantric exercises, is that it's 30 men in the room, but you have a female body there. You have some kind of woman that respects and understands the mechanism of what goes on, because when a woman or a female body is needed, she must be there. For example, in ayahuasca, when you drink ayahuasca with only men or only women, there's always the opposite gender present, because otherwise you can't do it. So the question is, if you live as a philosopher or a psychoanalyst among women to study women, you discover that their conception of monogamy is that's just about a focus, and it's a temporary focus. And the temporary focus, you fall in love, you're attracted to each other through intuition. You then learn to know each other slightly, but not too much. You keep on being in love, you're romantically involved, you fuck each other, and often the woman gets pregnant. But if women would have their way, after they've given birth, which they do with other women, men should not be in the room when women give birth, just like men should not have an opinion on abortion or not. There are a lot of things where I'm very adamant that men should not be concerned with those things. There's no way you as a man can understand what it means to do an abortion. So just get out of the room. If you made a woman pregnant, it's your responsibility. But she has to decide when she gives birth to the child or not, and she probably sees an older woman for advice if she's smart. It's a relationship between the pregnant woman and the matriarch. Don't go in there. When it comes to childbirth, when it comes to abortion, these realms should be for women only. And women are really comfortable when the matriarch, the midwife, delivers the baby, women cheer her on, and if the baby is found in the mother's fine, we celebrate. Then that's when you come into the room as a man with a cigar in your mouth. And something that transcends you has just been born, a child, and you're the father of a child, that you're so proud of the woman, you're so proud of the child, it's intensely beautiful. That's when monogamy really happens, but only for a brief while after that, because women aren't really interested in pursuing the same man for the next child. Originally, they probably never did. Women fall out of love when the child starts sucking the woman's tit. And we should describe that as a sexual relationship, because it is. It's a sexual relationship between child and woman when the child sucks the mother's tit, the mamela. And that's, of course, when men get furious with the child because the child has taken their position, because they want to suck her tit and they want to fuck her pussy, and they don't have access to the pussy any longer, so the pussy's locked up and she's not very interested. And I recommend people, you know, it's okay. If we had a society where you could actually get the divorce right there and then, we probably had a better society. But that's monogamy to women. Monogamy to women is a temporary process to lock in a certain man, keep him interested in her and the baby. And once the baby is delivered, the baby's tribal property, and the baby is raised by the matriarchs. That's what babies are in all ancient cultures. And I think it would be much sounder than sort of culture we have today. You know, the father running around equally as the mother, spend as much time with the child as the mother does, blah, 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 blah. You know, we say at the same time, we teach children that there's no difference between father and mother, but it's very important to spend at least 50% of the time with each one of them. It's just, but why would it matter if they're not different? You know, they have different representations to us. The phallus and the mamilla are very different representations to us as human beings. So I want to go back to biology and basically reformulate raising children with biology. And that's where monogamy comes in. Monogamy is not really of interest to anybody. It's not about to raise kids. It's just boring.
Do you, so like monogamy as a social structure has emerged, like I believe somewhere like 200 years ago. Now it's normalized. And whenever I talk with people who are monogamous, and when I used to be not monogamous, you know, people rationally and consciously proclaim that, yeah, I just love her so much and I want to be with her. But underneath, there seems to be a lot of jealousy and anxiety and insecurity.
Yeah. And the men are looking for intimacy from the woman, which women hate, because giving intimacy to a man means having a little boy who's sucking your tit. It's very unsexy. And women are looking for sex and love. They're looking for the man to protect her, provide for her, and date her, and give her the fucking focus all the time, and listen to everything she babbles about, you know. But, you know, the hour every afternoon that you have as a woman, when you really want to talk about every detail that happened to you that day, don't do it with your fucking husband, because he will be bored to death and not fuck you that night. Get a gay friend. They love gossip. Or do it with your friends, your girlfriends. Sit down with your girlfriends, go shopping or whatever. Tell the husband to go and pick up the kid, you know, at the daycare center at 4, while you go out and have a glass of wine with your friends and babble it all off, and change the testosterone in your body into estrogen, because then you want to fuck your man that evening. And if you want to keep your sexuality going for as long as possible, you need to learn these technical little tricks and not overburden your partner with things your partner actually do not want. But women and men do this all the time, and that's why they fall straight into couple therapy and into divorces constantly, because they're basically burdening their partner with things their partner didn't want. And it's all about the cult of transparency. I would expose everything about myself to my husband. Well, that's not what he wants from you. He wants your pussy. If you expose everything to him, mystery's dead, and it would throw you out and fuck anything that moves with the pussy that isn't you. And the same thing for husbands or men. I want my woman to really know me. We have a very transparent relationship. And I'm just like, oh God, this cult of transparency again. No, you should have a cult of sex. You should have a cult of sexual attraction. Yeah. And it starts in not telling your wife absolutely everything. She doesn't want to know a lot of things. It's like when guys come to me and say, oh, I've been unfaithful to my wife. All right, we all are, you know. I know I'm unfaithful. I have to go home and tell her. It's like, no, number one, you weren't faithful to her. And number two, you go home and burden her with that knowledge, because then she has to split from you. Because then she has to say, oh, why did you tell me? Because now once you told me, I must not be turned on by you and I have to kick you out. Stupid idiot. Because you just want to unburden yourself. Like I always say, understanding tantric sex starts with this one little simple rule. Never turn your partner into your therapist.
Yeah. And that's
never.
Esther Perel, this genius therapist, constantly talks about this.
Yes.
We try to turn one person into what a village used to give us: a best friend, a business partner, whatever, the best sexual partner, and it doesn't work.
No, at least make your best friend that instead, and then say your best friend doesn't have pussy, so you can fuck women as much as you like. You have a best friend, and then you can turn your best friend into everything the tribe is supposed to give you, and your friend can put up limits, say, no, I'm not that, because your friend will tell you.
Exactly.
Your woman won't. Your woman won't tell you that, because she will be, you know, trying so hard to be generous. And the same thing goes for men. Men are trying so hard to be abundant. The man in the heterosexual relationship represents abundance. He wants to create abundance to impress the woman, because that turns her on. And she wants to give him generosity. What the breasts, the mamillas, and the matrix represent sexually to the man is generosity. A woman is not generous, is not sexy. But a woman is generous, is very sexy. A man who's created abundance and come home in the evening and say, look what an abundance I created today. Look how hard I worked. The hunt went well, the war went well, and I made money, and, you know, look what I created. And the woman goes, oh, what a great husband I have. Love you, darling. You know, and it got the estrogen flowing through my system right now. Please fuck me, right? Sex is Sex is at the end of the day. Sex is the reward system. And it is the reward for the man having to create an abundance and for the woman having created the sense of generosity. That's the trick to all sexuality. That's the trick to all great sex. And then tantric sex essentially is just the details. But you can't go into the tantric realm sexually unless you fundamentally understood these things first.
Yeah, I totally agree. You have to be willing to work with all these things on an emotional, embodied level. So one last question that we touched on sex, drugs, and so psychoanalysis as Tantra. Do we mean the method or the practice? Do we mean like free association, or are we just using its theory?
No. This is the great thing. So a really good therapist learn both psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. The reason why I have both terms is because one of them is tantric, one of them is sutric. A psychotherapist usually gets a license from the government. That reveals everything about the art of psychotherapy. It's all about fixing you to send you back into society. It's part of the taxation system. It's part of politics. It's part of the official system. So you train yourself to become a psychologist, and then you go from psychologist to psychotherapist. So psychotherapist, essentially psychologists who practices psychology on people. And the trick with psychology, we're going to fix you. We're going to make you happier if you're sad. We're going to send you back into society. We're going to make you love your children. We're going to make sure your family works. We're going to make sure you go to work again and pick up a salary, and you take care of yourself. That's what psychotherapy does. That's what you get a government license to do it. Psychoanalysts can never operate under any government whatsoever, because psychoanalysis is typically tantric in that it questions absolutely everything. So if people want to go into psychoanalysis, you must first do your psychotherapy. Again, you must first do the sutra properly and completely.
Like Alexa also emphasized.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do the psychotherapy first. When you're fixed and reasonably healthy and sound and have an understanding of who you are, then you can go into psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis is the incessant pursuit of truth, no matter what. This is why in the psychoanalytic practice, you constantly come to the point where you say, oh God, I wish I didn't know this. And the psychoanalyst just tells you, well, now you do, so now you have to live with it. You asked for it, now you have to live with it. So you remove all these different axioms, all these things you took for granted until there's nothing left that grants any solid foundation whatsoever. And then you discover that your own subjectivity is completely empty.
Right. So that's so similar to the tantric realm insofar as there is no guarantee. And if you have this idea that there is this guarantee, I will be enlightened, I will step over my problems, then you're not ready for it.
No, because there's so many shocks along the way that the guy who you were, who pursued, I want to be enlightened, has also been exposed as a falsery.
Right.
The whole desire to be enlightened was dirty and shadowy to begin with. It was a desire for all the wrong reasons. And once you get there, it has no attraction any longer, and it loses its attraction. You're removing objects of attraction constantly in psychoanalysis until there's hardly anything left.
Yeah.
And that's when psychoanalysis is finished, when there's nothing else to find there. And the reason why Freud put the psychoanalyst, technically speaking, at the post end of the room, so you don't have eye contact with the psychoanalyst. You only briefly hear the psychoanalyst's voice. There's a big point to that. It's very, very tantric, because if you could look him in the eye, he would then fall for your charm. He could be manipulated, and you would be driven towards manipulating, like if you dated the analyst rather than the analyst being an analyst. So in psychotherapy, you want a warm, embracing, empathetic person to talk to, like an old wise woman, an old wise man. That's psychotherapy. In psychoanalysis, you're basically talking to an ice cold wall that just reflects you back on yourself. And when psychoanalysis is finished, it's almost like the analyst was never there. It's almost like you just talked to yourself all the time until there was nothing left. And the removal of all these axioms you take for granted is the pursuit towards truth, because there is no other truth except complete emptiness when you arrive there in psychoanalysis. So that's why Hegel is so damn interesting when you combine him with Freud, and you get guys like Lacan because of that, because it is the work towards the negation in the most profound sense, the negation of yourself. And then you discover that your own sense of self is nothing but the negation of that negation. It is because the body cannot live with a void. So the body has to throw things into the void constantly. And that's your life.
And
that's what your life is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful, because the phenomenology of spirit, in some sense, is this journey where you're getting rid of all objects, and at the end you're at absolute knowing, when there is no interest in the object. So there is this empty subjectivity.
And here's where René Girard comes in. You heard a lot about Girard. Everybody reads Girard these days because we have to understand why things like advertising don't work any longer. You know, the whole new internet environment requires a thinker like René Girard. He understands the lynch mob, he understands mimicking, he understands the forces in a culture and how they operate. It's a very dark philosophy. He's great. Like, so if you take Girard into this, then you discover also, when you look at the Tantric, Girard does not discuss the difference between Tantric and Sutric. He is actually Catholic, so he doesn't discuss the difference. That's a bit what's lacking in Girard, but you can find that in Lacan and in other places. But the difference between the Tantric and the Sutric here, when he returns in a Girardian way, is exactly the word of crazy wisdom. And you know that Thomas Hammerich and Andrew Sweeney and I have developed this in podcast, and I'm also writing about it with Jan Soderqvist and Cattle Last in my books. And what this means is that there has to be the difference between the Tantric and the Sutric specifically here, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So let's go back. I was trying to formulate that. The crazy wisdom teacher is an asshole, an absolute asshole. He steals your wife from you. He's a drunkard. He's an alcoholic. He takes drugs like crazy. He does all the things you're not supposed to do. He's Tantric in the deepest sense, that he's an asshole. That's what a crazy wisdom teacher is. The reason why he acts that way is because you cannot mimic it. You decide, I don't want to be that. I don't know what I want to be, but I don't want to be that. But you cannot stop listening to the crazy wisdom teachers, because occasionally out of his mouth comes the ultimate wisdom, the little tricks. The guy has seen through it all. And you realize that behind this facade of the assholism of the crazy wisdom teacher is the real truth. Nobody lives closer to the real than the crazy wisdom teacher. He's the ultimate shaman, right? But he has to be an asshole because you mimicked your entire life. You mimic others all the way. You mimic other men and how they fuck. You want your woman you're fucking to mimic women you've seen in porn movies. You mimic everywhere. This is, Thomas Hammerich is great at explaining how René Girard sees the world as being drenched in mimicry. But there is a possibility before you become fully tantric, and you can become a tantric teacher yourself, including a crazy wisdom teacher, is to understand what crazy wisdom is absolutely necessary as the last step. It is the teacher who's the non-teacher and throws back at you, there's no teaching left. There's no teacher. There's nothing there. And that's what psychoanalysts do in psychoanalysis. At the end of the day, it's just an ice cold wall. And when I practice psychoanalysis, the last rule, when I break the last session, probably at an unexpected point in time, you're through, you're finished. What? It's just, yeah, it's typically on a Tuesday afternoon at 14:22. You're through, you've done your 27 sessions or whatever, we're through with you. Well, why? Because everything we wanted to fix with you, we fixed. We got through the door. There's nothing more to find here. And then I tell them, and I must remind you that the number one rule of psychoanalysis is that if you meet me, the psychoanalyst in the street, don't say hi to me. I'm not your fucking friend. I'm not a member of your tribe. I'm a complete alien. I'm crazy wisdom. I'm a really tough experience in your life. There's nothing nice about me at all. And you don't say hi to me. And when you see me in the street, you probably see me with somebody else who's either my patient or analyst on, or a friend of mine. But not you. You're no longer there. You no longer get my gaze. I will completely ignore you. And that's when you discover, as an analyst on, that the entire analysis was really your own process with yourself. And there was nothing else there. So it's the total opposite of psychotherapy. It's nobody's nice and empathetic to you. It's a very, very cold, hard process all the way to the end. That's why it's tantric.
It seems like it's, whereas tantric sex and the TNT work on the level of the body, psychoanalysis works more in an intellectualized manner.
Yes, it's the tantric idea.
Right.
But I personally, I do not practice psychoanalysis unless people have done the sex work first. I don't trust a person who don't have a good sex life.
Yeah, it's for the same reason that TNT starts with the sex, and then you get the transmission and the ego work workshops.
Vartman and I agree very strongly that you must do the sex work first before you can even approach spirituality, because otherwise you train people to become fucking boy pharaohs and pillar saints. And a boy pharaoh is somebody who believes in his cock, for example, but he hates anybody who can think because he's not very good at thinking and he has no self-confidence in his mind. And a pillar saint is somebody who's above the throat. They think they're higher or more noble or superior to others, but really they hate their tiny little dick and they hate sex. These two characters are the most dangerous characters in culture. The world is full of pillar saints today. Therefore, it's also full of boy pharaohs. And this is why if the body is where your self-confidence resides, then train yourself to allow others to be impressed with your body, but then start working on your mind. But start with the body. Start where you have self-confidence. Tantric work starts with your self-confidence. Oh, you got a big dick. Great. An asset. But you know what? Big dick guys are often very lousy at sex because they think the dick will do the job for them. Yeah. So we still need to work on the practice. Okay. But, you know, good material to start with. Congratulations. There are women who love this very much. Even men do. So, yeah, a good start, you know, or you got a pretty face. Good place to start. Okay. You're young. You're not old and shrinky, whatever. You can start from somewhere on your journey towards tantric sex. You always start with a self-confidence. You point out to people, this is actually your strongest point. Really? That? I just do that. It's like nothing for me. Yeah, but for the rest of us, it's magic. Do it. But then gradually you can start approaching the weaker points and what you're shamed about and start approaching that until you finally remove all shame and guilt. And the work of tantric sex is not finished until all shame and guilt has been removed. You can tell how non-Christian this is, right?
Yeah.
That's tantric. And then when you've done that work, you can start looking at tantric pharmacology. And you can certainly look at tantric philosophy. And you can go through psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis can either run parallel with or separate from tantric pharmacology. You can use psychedelics to get shortcuts in your analytical process. And that's, of course, what mushrooms, and LSD, and especially ayahuasca can do for you. That's certainly the case. It's allowed to use shortcuts. You can use anything you like to get to where you want to get. That's okay. But sometimes it's better to do them separate from each other as well. But I always do the sex first, because also it's not only that it has to be done first. I think in our society, it has to be done first. Because you and I fundamentally don't trust brothers. We don't trust other men who haven't fixed their sex life.
Oh, no.
We require it.
Yeah, that's the thing about sex is that once you're naked with each other, you can't hide anything. Everything will show up. Everyone will see it. You know, maybe you won't see it yourself.
That's why traders have always gone to whorehouses together. It's called nightclubs these days, and it's much more boring. But, you know, the nightclub used to be the whorehouse. And the reason why you went with an erect penis with a stranger and you fucked a woman together and you were both unfaithful to your wives at home was because then you could do trade with each other for the next 30 years. Nakedness has an enormous potential towards honesty.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah,
that's why I love nude beach. I love nude beaches. You know why nude beaches are wonderful? Because there's something incredibly liberating with just taking all your clothes off and showing yourself naked with other men and women. And you know what? Nude beaches are calm. Nobody makes a fuss about themselves. As soon as you put on the fucking swim trunks, people start to perform.
Right. Yeah.
That's the brilliance of nude beaches. And I don't trust the culture doesn't have.
It's not even necessarily sexual in that way. You know, it's not like nude beaches are full of orgies. It's just very a mature way of dealing with our bodies.
I would say that it's a perfect example that in the sutric realm, the nude beach becomes less sexy than the textiled beach. In the tantric realm, it's very possible that the naked bodies themselves can be attractive. But when you're in the tantric realm, clothes on or off doesn't matter any longer. You can imagine clothes on somebody if you see them. Yeah, because in the tantric realm, it's like no, it doesn't work that way any longer because I can just meet anybody, see them properly, come up with a reason why having sex together would be a really good idea, and then seduce them, right? So I would say that in the tantric realm, then certainly nudity has a strong sexual component. But yes, in the sutric realm, this is absolutely correct. And that's why people are terrified of nude beaches, because it exposes them without hiding behind a sexual persona. Whereas the sexual persona is enhanced with the bikinis and the swim trunks and the things in the regular textile beach. But I hate textile beaches. If there's a nude beach, it's always preferable, to be honest about it. And I love whorehouses. God, I love the sex trade. God, are sex workers the only people you can really trust? I'm beginning to think that's the case. I don't think I can truly trust anybody except somebody who's a professional sex worker. Then I can certainly trust. So where did you arrive with this? Because you have written a, by the way, beautiful piece to the Hegel Anthology coming out this fall. We're both participating in the Hegel Anthology.
Yes,
Catalast
yes,
is compiling at the moment. So what was your experience in having the door open to tantric sex? It could have been tantric psychedelics, but in your case, it was certainly tantric sexology. The door is open. You're now immersed in the TNT in Holland, where you live. How did this affect your very young philosophical mind?
Oh, that's it's a super big question. I mean, it definitely has sexually matured me, and it doesn't mean like, you know, like of course there's been technical improvements and stuff like that, but I would say that, you know, all the lessons from TNT, like there's no goal in sex. It's about empathy. It's about slowing down. It's about connection. This has all resonated not only in my sexual life, but also my daily life. So I would say that if I wouldn't have gone there and would have just lived out my sexual life in this loose way without those containers, I would have definitely matured sexually way slower. So of course it was like, it was the most intense week of my life, those 2 tantric workshops. I was so, yeah, it's crazy what your body can do when you're in the tantric realm.
And for young women, we should say this is even more dramatic. Young women are so obsessed with the clitoris orgasm, and have even not begun to explore the capacity of their own bodies. You can go up to 7 different orgasms with a female body. And I think it's the biggest tragedy of our time is that women do not develop fully sexually. Yeah, and I think this is the trick of the TNT is that it's incredibly women friendly and it's focused on female sexuality and trains men to basically serve female sexuality because it is the focus of the work. And I think this is deeply tantric. It's like you've got to start with the female body and work with that. In our culture today, that women have hardly experienced more than 2, at most 3 orgasms instead of the 7 they could explore. It's just a tragedy.
Yeah, that's the sex as this contraction, you know, this people keep contracting with the spasm orgasm, the clitoral orgasm, and just the penis for men. So that's definitely something that really doesn't interest me so much anymore.
Yeah, men are coming all the time and women are focusing too much on the clitoris orgasm. Those are the 2 major problems you need to do. And funny, this has nothing to do with tantric sex. This is just basic sexology. This is the real sutra of sex.
Right, but you have to go to the new tantra to learn this.
Exactly, you have to go to a grown-up school on sex to learn how to do sex. Much better investment than jerking off to porn. Nothing wrong with pornography at all, I love it. But jerking off to porn will not teach you anything. What you need to do is to go to proper school of sex and learn what sex is. And you need to learn the sutra first before you learn the tantra.
I mean, I think, you know, I don't have any moral issue against porn, but I do think like this fixation, you know, if you watch porn throughout the years, like basically all men are doing in our society, it fixates the visual cortex. So you start like having problems with getting your penis up or even having sex with girls. So that's the problem with porn, I would say.
It's the exact equivalent of removing kick-seeking from tantric pharmacology. So when you work with psychedelics, the problem, there's people coming in through the door and think it's about the kicks. And they have a hedonism they take with them inside. And the first thing you need to do is to kill that. And what you do, you probably give them a really bad drug experience on purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
That was good for you. Oh, that was so horrible. Good for you. That can happen at any time. You have no control over this process. We will not guarantee you anything, and will certainly not guarantee that you get the kicks that you're seeking. Because kick seeking is fundamentally infantile, right?
Yeah, and this is the problem with like this with porn is that, again, no moral issue with it, but you're motivating this narcissistic autoerotic, you know, stuff.
Yeah,
sex is not that. Like sex is indeed how to serve the feminine, and how to really connect deeply and have this thing going on with each other. So that's really my issue with porn.
Yeah, my recommendation I do with the younger guys is that I said it's not a bad idea actually to jerk off to porn with your best friend when you're on the drug. This sounds absurd, but it is actually. I never thought about this. Oh God, no, it works because to expose your sexual fantasies and your porn addiction to a brother who suffers from a parallel porn addiction, but not the same one, can be a really good idea. Often this leads to the guys signing up for the sex course after the experience, and then they realize that we should really have fucked the woman instead of fucking the porn. So the porn became the third, and they realized porn isn't that good of a third with two guys. Why don't we try to pursue finding a woman together and have sex with her together and be two men who fuck a woman together, and then discovering that what the woman loves being fucked by two men is them being completely interconnected with each other. The impressive thing is that there's no rivalry. Again, going back to Girard, is when two men have entirely removed the rivalry between each other and are full of brotherly love and admiration for each other, they can really erotically go towards agape with a woman and give her the pleasure she wants. And of course, this can be reversed with two women seducing a man together.
Right.
So what I say is that it's not uncommon that the sexual practice occurs when you take psychedelics, but it's not sex. It is an extension of the psychedelic experience. What I call it among men when they get a bit terrified, I was just like, it's not about being gay, because gay guys would probably do this with their fag hack. So the gay guy would probably take the drug and then have some kind of a, jerking off to porn with a fag hack, because it would be interested in heterosexuality and dare to be interested in it for the first time. And she would finally get access to male homosexuality she's attracted to, and they can explore each other's work. Now, if you see it that way, you realize the extension of the psychedelic experience is that you can then use psychedelic experience to go into the psych. You need, of course, guidance. You need to understand what you're doing. You must be careful when you do this, but you can do it. And what you then do is you get rid of the addiction. I even do the same thing, and then I guide it for alcoholics. So what I do when we, for example, use psychedelics to treat alcoholism is that I let the alcoholics drink wine together on the psychedelic only, not to get drunk, because you don't want to mix the drug with the alcohol.
Right.
The point is that your relationship to the bottle, your relationship to the glass is exposed as an addictive fantasy with somebody who suffers from the same thing, but has a different relationship to the bottle and the glass. And in that exploration, in the parallax between the two, you discover that this is just falsehood. This is just my own narcissistic obsession. In the very comparative study, both guys give up at the same time, say, oh God, wine is not the same thing any longer. And said, I probably even have to send you some kind of winery somewhere to get a course on how actually good a wine can be to drink instead of abusing. But let's wait with that. Let's just enjoy complete sobriety for a few months first. Right. And that's how you use psychedelics. So you can visit all the practice you do in your regular life with psychedelic states, and then explore in that process, explore exactly what went wrong or what was going on there. So you can play with these things much more eventually as you go deeper into the tantric, but I always emphasize, when you go into that realm first, do it in the right order. And I think it's absolutely perfect. Fix your sex life first before you do anything else. Then you can start experimenting with the other areas with somebody who can guide you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming. Let's wrap and end up here.
Yeah, great having me. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
You're a brilliant young man. Your texts are already fantastic. You write really well, and I want to follow your thinking the rest of my life. Okay. I want to follow it. I think it's intensely beautiful and very, very sharp. And act your age, stay your age, be a young philosopher. Enjoy being a young philosopher, as you will one day, as I do today, enjoy being an older philosopher.
Right. Yep. Thanks a lot, man.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
Good day.
Big love.